Okay, I think we'll get started. My name's Richard Eckard from the University of Melbourne. I'm chairing the webinar today. This webinar is a part of a series of webinars being hosted by the Forewarned Forearmed national program. So today we're having an overview of two major programs, managing climate variability and the extreme events forecasting, which is the Forewarned Forearmed program. So let me introduce the speaker for today, Doug McNicholl from Meat and Livestock Australia. Doug's the manager of sustainable innovation at MLA, overseeing their investments into innovation processes where sustainability considerations, being environmental, social and financial, are integrated into the Australian red meat value chain from idea generation through to commercialization. This applies to new technology, products and services, as well as new businesses and organization models. Today, Doug is providing us with an overview of the Managing Climate Variability and Extreme Events Forecasting programs, as those are two programs that he looks after from a MLA perspective and behalf of a consortium of research providers. So thank you, Doug. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks for the introduction, and hello, everyone. It's great to be with you. It's the first of the webinar series in the COVID period for me, so hopefully the event works glitch-free for us all. Now, I want to open by saying that I'm not a climate scientist, and the messages that I'll be looking to convey today are really for a producer audience, and I'm going to be focusing on the messages that talk about the products, so the outputs from the investments that MLA and our consortium members are investing in, and the benefits for individual producers in the industry more broadly. This webinar is part of a series of webinars, so the more detailed insights in terms of the new extreme events forecast products that will start to hit the market from the years 2022 onwards will be provided greater insight into those products in the next webinar series. So today's really going to be focusing on an overview of the Managing Climate Variability Program, an introduction to the Forewarned Forearmed Project and the extreme event forecast, but also letting attendees know how to get involved, whether you're a producer who wants to get involved in our community of practice that has been established for the Bureau to undertake research and trialling of forecast products, or whether you're an investor looking to invest in research and development activities in this area. So without further ado, the purpose of today's webinar is to ultimately raise awareness and understanding of investments into seasonal forecasting through the Managing Climate Variability Program, but also extreme events through the Forewarned Forearmed investment product. We also want to provide a taster of the extreme events forecast products that are in the pipeline and soon to be released in the coming years, and encourage attendees to get involved in both of these programs. The Managing Climate Variability Program is a lead research and development program in Australia and has been operating for the past 2 decades. It's focused on providing climate knowledge to primary producers, but also natural resource managers. It was established as a vehicle to invest in better forecast products as well as information tools, and I'll provide an insight into those in a moment, as well as provide case studies of people being producers who are incorporating climate risk information into their business decision-making processes. And through the Climate Kelpie website, you will see a number of case studies demonstrating producers translating this knowledge into actionable insight. And also the MCV program runs in 4-year phases, and the current phase concludes in 2021. Meat and Livestock Australia acts as the Research and Development Program Manager for the program on behalf of 5 key investing RDCs, and we kind of share the load collectively. Different RDCs take on the contracting management role under various phases of work. As I said, MLA is acting in that role under the current phase until 2021. The objective of the Managing Climate Variability Program is to increase the capacity of Australian agriculture to capture opportunities and manage downside risk arising from climate variability and change. How is this achieved? Firstly, by engaging the major ag industries on this issue, then investing in the development of practical tools for producers and NRM managers, and also profiling early adopters of these new knowledge products. Now, when we try and think about our investment approach in relation to seasonal forecasting, MLA tries to articulate our approach in terms of outputs that we expect from our investments, which you can see here on the left-hand side in this vertical silo. Then outcomes that arise from those outputs, and at an industry level, what are the key impacts that we're seeking to materialise by investing in these programs. So the outputs that have been generated by MCV to date are seasonal forecast products and extension services that translate climate research outputs into actionable insights for the Australian agricultural sector. And there are 2 key extension outlets through MCV. The first of which is the Climate Kelpie website, and I'll provide a larger expansion of this in a moment, where we house all of the outputs from the investments made in the MCV program. So that's links to reports, links to new forecast products, links to new decision-making tools, all available from via the Climate Kelpie website. And I also give you an example of what is a commonly used tool and decision-making tool, being the Climate application, which you can download from iOS or Google Play, and also the Climate website, which enables users to look up historical weather data for their nearest weather station, and I'll provide an example of that in a moment, but also ask themselves some questions about where the season's heading. Now, once these outputs, or if these outputs are provided to industry in a way that they can actually use them and incorporate the knowledge in their decision-making process on farm, there are a series of outcomes that can arise from this. And ultimately, what we're seeking to do is increase awareness of seasonal climate forecasts and boost or improve user confidence, because we know that 7 to 10 day forecasts are generally speaking quite accurate. Once we get into the weeks and seasons ahead, the confidence interval is lower due to fundamental restrictions in modelling capacity and the amount of data captured to enable seasonal forecast modelling. And that's why we continue to invest in this area, so that ultimately we can improve the skill of the forecast and user confidence in those forecasts. And if we think about why is that important as an outcome, well, it's because the impact that these forecast tools can deliver or contribute to delivering can be considered in economic, environmental and social terms. So specifically, looking at minimising the downside financial risk of seasonal climate variability, but also maximise the upside financial opportunity, because it's not all downside risk. And important to note here that in 2014, the Centre for International Economics estimated that the potential value of improved seasonal forecasts for the ag sector ranged from in excess of $900 to $1.9 million, $1.9 billion per year in 2014. And if the variability continues to increase, so climate variability continues to increase, that number will also increase. So everyone, I think, on this webinar appreciates that climate variability and risk is one of the key drivers of agricultural production and income. But we also know that by improving our ability to manage seasonal variability, we will also deliver improved environmental stewardship outcomes as custodians of the vast majority of Australia's landscape in the agricultural sector. That also deliver healthier, happier livestock and people, and as well as more productive grains and all of the other agricultural commodity industries as well, because we know how intrinsically linked climate variability and change is with the psyche of Australia and of the Australian agricultural sector. Now, the budget invested under MCV in its current phase is $3.5 million. As I say, we're getting close to the final phase. One of the key investments placed through MCV is the Forearmed project, which I'll come into in a moment, and just some acknowledgement of the key stakeholders involved in the Managing Climate Variability Program, our partner RDCs, Grains and Research Development Corporation, Sugar Research Australia, Cotton RDC, Agri-Futures, but also the Department of Ag and Water Resources, and it's obviously its new departmental name. Now, just a couple of examples of outputs from MCV. So I mentioned the Climate Kelpie website. What you can see on the left-hand side here is a snapshot from one of the pages on the Climate Kelpie website, and which is the Climate Dogs National Forecast information reservoir. And this is taken from a snapshot from the website today, where we can see that the questions asked what's been predicted in June, and the page presents a whole range of predictions from publicly available websites at a regional level and also across a temporal level as well. So you can see a history of these forecasts. Another example is, I mentioned earlier, the Climate website and mobile applications. On the screen here, you can see the climate analyses of the Jalaka truck stop, which is my nearest truck stop. I'm farm-based from Jalaka in Queensland, and often I check the historic trends of the Jalaka truck stop and compare that with the current season, which is what you can see on this chart here, which is showing the percentile value of the season relative to other years selected. So you can get an indication of tracking against average, and it's just really useful information to provide historic context of the current season. But you can also analyse different questions around how often certain events occur, how wet and whether nitrate should be applied if you're a grains producer, potential yield estimates, drought events, how hot and cold it's been, etc., etc. So if you haven't accessed this information source, you can do so via the Climate website link, and this is it here, or you can download the app in iOS or Google Play. And Rich, I can see there's a bunch of questions popping up there now, but I haven't read them yet, so just reach out if you think I need to address any of those. Now, I'd also like to provide you an introduction to the extreme events forecasting, in particular the Forewarned is Forearmed Rural R&D for Profit project. As I mentioned earlier, extreme events and climate variability are among the largest drivers of agricultural production. We know that considerable use is made of weather forecasts in the 1 to 7 or 1 to 10 day period. However, no information is available on the chance of extreme events, and I'll talk about some examples of that in the weeks or the seasons ahead. So therefore, this is acknowledged through the investment partners in the Managing Climate Variability Program, and was the fundamental premise around which the Forewarned is Forearmed project was developed, which was to provide forecasts, or that providing forecasts of extreme events, high or low rainfall, heat, cold or frost, will provide direct value to producers by equipping them with the information and tools to be forewarned and forearmed or prepared for these events in the future. Now, that's certainly not easy to do. And we certainly know that from recent experience. The Forewarned is Forearmed will provide the first forecast of extreme climate events that we're aware of anywhere, with the aim of decreasing their economic impact, economic, social and environmental impact on our industry, but the communities in the community more broadly. And again, I'd like to acknowledge the investment partners and research and development partners involved in the project. You can see at the bottom of this slide. A little bit of an insight in terms of the plan of attack for the project. Again, the objective is to equip Australian agricultural value chains to foresee and proactively manage the impacts of extreme climate events. How will this objective be achieved? By improving extreme events forecasts in the weeks to seasons ahead, develop new forecast tools specifically for producers, and then communicate these outputs in a way that can be understood by end users. So the project budget is 14 million, including cash and in-kind, kicked off in 2017 and will run until 2022 when the forecast products aim to be released. Now, there'll be at least 5 new extreme events forecast products that will be made available on the Bureau of Meteorology website. And the forecast products are based on the Bureau's seasonal forecast system, Access X, which is the system that drives the models. In addition to that, the project will provide extreme event risk management plans for the contributing agricultural industries. So that's red meat, dairy, wine, grains, sugar, pork, rice and cotton. And it also has established, and again, those of you online, if you're not involved, we welcome you to be involved, in a community of practice of researchers, advisors and producers to improve the understanding of these new forecast products, but also help in the co-design of them so that they can be interpreted correctly and be utilised in business decision making. The outcome sought from these outputs is to improve the understanding of industry needs in relation to extreme event forecasts on multi-week and seasonal timescales, because it's not necessarily well understood by the scientists and the research communities that what's not necessarily well understood are the specific needs of the different sectors in relation to these forecast products. So these things aren't assumed, which is why these community of practices have been developed to ensure that the products are fit for purpose. Now, if there's improved understanding of industry needs, that should lead to increased understanding of amongst scientists in the community of the drivers of extreme events and the use of the products, therefore enabling improved ability of extreme events to be predicted within acceptable confidence intervals. Now, we also need to accept the limitations of modelling and data collection to inform these models. Therefore, we're never, at this point in time, we're unable to be 100% confident of these events occurring in the future. So it's the role of these investments to provide forecasts with a level of confidence that end users can understand and factor into their decision making. And the impacts sought from these investments are similar to the Managing Climate Variability Program, but they're more attuned to the impacts of extreme events. So extreme events being beyond, in the 9th to 10th decile of a band of events. So now that's in terms of in economics terms, extreme event risks be minimised and opportunities maximised. And think of that in terms of livestock productivity and reduced mortality in extreme events like extreme flood, extreme cold, extreme heat. So knowing the chance of those events will aid businesses to make decisions to mitigate that risk. Now, it's not going to make the problem go away in its entirety. However, there will be things that producers can do to reduce the risk of these extreme events. And thinking about it in other sectors' terms, it would also improve decision-making around crop choice, planting time, whether you decide to irrigate or not in the lead up to an extreme heat event, for example, and even the application of fertiliser and the rate of application. And as I mentioned earlier on MCV, one of the key benefits here are also beyond economic terms. So improving our ability to be great environmental stewards, and also contributing to the health and well-being of livestock and the people that work in our industries, whether you're a pen rider that's working in feedlots, working in the periods of extreme heat, understanding the chances of those events occurring and putting measures in place to reduce the impact of that heat on staff, for example, as well as livestock. Now we're getting there and can move into some Q&A in a moment, but I would like to give you some insight in terms of the scope of the Forewarned is Forearmed project, some of the products in its prototype stage, and to just leave you with some points of contact. The Forewarned is Forearmed project is pulling data in from weather stations or industry reference stations right across the country, which is what you can see on this map of Australia here. And the different coloured dots represent the different industries that are involved and the reference stations within those industries. So you can see lots of data coverage from the reference stations across the country. And here are just some example prototype products. Now, what you see here on the left-hand side won't necessarily be what is released on the Bureau Met website. So these are experimental products. And you might be answering questions like, in the next fortnight, will the northern end experience unusually hot days and nights? And an answer to that question might be yes. There is a greater than 80% chance that the day and night temperatures will be hot, i.e. in decile 10, in that extreme range. And it's showing up in a colour coding system across the northern parts of the country. Another example prototype might be an extreme cold. So again, similar type of question. Over the next week, what is the chance of overnight temperatures being very cold in Thargomindah? And the answer might be, well, there's a 75% chance of a 1 in 3 cold week that is in the bottom tertile in Thargomindah, in this region here. And a final kind of example might be from the 1st of January to the 1st of April, what is the chance of it being very wet in Bridport, Tasmania? And which the answer might be a 36% chance of a 1 in 5 wet 3 months, aka, or for example, in the deciles 9 and 10 in that geographic region. So you can see it's been presented in a range of confidence intervals across a range of statistical bands, which will enable end users to form their own conclusions about the potential chance of these events. Now, one of the real challenges for the research team is packaging this information up in a way that a producer can easily interpret and understand. And so with that in mind, we really want to call out to producers, farm advisors, agronomists, anyone who's involved in the agricultural ecosystem, to get involved in the community of practice, which is a community of practice set up to prototype and trial and iterate these forecast products to ensure they're designed in a fit-for-purpose manner. If you'd like to be engaged in that process, please reach out to Kate Finger at BCG, and there's a contact or an email address there. If you'd like to learn more about Forewarned is Forearmed more generally, please contact the National Coordinator, Russell Patterson, or reach out to myself. If you'd like to review the experimental products again, you could do that being part of the community of practice, or you'd like to have more direct dialogue around the experimental products, again, please reach out to Russell or Dr. Deb Hudson at the Bureau of Met, and that's Debbie's details here. Debbie will be delivering one of the next webinars around the forecast products where you'll get a much more detailed insight in terms of their look and feel. And if you'd like to invest or potentially invest or understand if you can invest in the Forewarned is Forearmed project or the Managing Climate Variability Program, please contact the respective national coordinator, who is Russell Patterson, and that's Russell's email address, or reach out to myself. So I might stop there, Rich, and pause for any questions, and hand back to you for that.
Great, thank you, Doug. That's very clear. An overview of both the MCV and extreme events forecasting. So I just encourage everybody online, because there's about there's 43 people online. It's probably too much to sort of open Q&A. So if you have a question, please type in the Q&A box. Graham, would you are you able to join us?
Yeah, can you hear me, Richard? Yep.
Can hear you well, thank you. One of the things that struck me, Doug, is there's a legacy effect that we probably forget to always identify of all of this history of managing climate variability and now Forewarned is Forearmed. What I mean by that is, Graham reminded me that the pilot of the Break newsletter was funded by MCV. You mentioned the app, that's a legacy of MCV. The Climate Dogs, an update to the Climate Dogs was a legacy of MCV. And a legacy from Forewarned is Forearmed is going to be these products that will be residing on the BOM website in perpetuity, one would hope. I think there's a temperature humidity index that we've introduced into the standard BOM reporting as well. So, I don't know, just opening a bit of dialogue on that.
That's right, Rich, and I think there will be a really important legacy from all of these programs, in that they also invest in capability and capacity building amongst the research community, also amongst producers, to not only invest in new knowledge, and this is cutting edge stuff that we're talking about in terms of looking at the weeks and the seasons ahead and our ability to understand what's coming at us. But not only undertaking that work, but translating it in a meaningful way to a small to medium enterprise business owner or producer on the ground trying to earn a living, and having that translated in a way that they believe in the confidence, or they can move forward with confidence. And that's not easily done. And, you know, by investing in programs like this, we are investing in our capacity and capability to do that work. I'm not aware of similar initiatives that exist at scale really anywhere. I mean, Australia is really the go-to place for these issues, particularly around droughts and modelling of impacts of droughts. And it's kind of world-leading stuff. But having said that, there's still a lot of work to be done. And, you know, MCV's got a very proud history of pioneering that work, and will continue to. And I think there's a long ream of scientists and producers who have benefited from these programs, and will continue to.
Right. Graham had a interesting analogy about dogs in the same kennel. Graham?
Yeah, thanks for the overview there. I just noticed there with some of the contacts that there's Russell, who's Miracle Dog, and then there's the Climate Dogs, all living at the Climate Kelpie, like one big, what is it about all these dogs and rainfall?
I have no idea if I can even answer that question, but I can't say I had it was my call to make the dogs the home of climate research. But look, we all know that a dog is a man and a woman's best friend, and you know, we all have a great affinity for dogs, and they're a really important part of agricultural life in Australia. And you know, they're great icons for the bush. And I think with that in mind, Birchip Cropping Group and the organisations involved in the communications and of the outputs from the climate and weather modelling programs, try and use iconic images and I guess reference points to help cut through with some marketing and communication activities. So look, it's a novel way of packaging these things up. Can I describe the link between dogs and climate? No, I can't.
No, it's some good stuff. And I think that there's a link there. They're all rounding up good information. So that's terrific. And thanks, too, for the leadership and bringing it all together, because the role of the MCV has been really important. Climate affects all industries, and it's great where MCV provides that, where the RDCs and all of the stakeholders across the country all team up, because climate doesn't just affect one industry at a time or one region. So there's some really good products there. And I know too, one of the key bits is there's some terrific sort of work happening within the climate science arena, but often agriculture, doesn't tap into it effectively. So there's been terrific projects over time that, thanks to the MCV, has actually brought ideas that are in the heads of some of the climate scientists and the Bureau modelers and brought them out to be tested with farmers. So that's good to see.
Well, it certainly is, Graham, and it's just want to also make point that I'm a newcomer to this space. Yourself and a number of others on the call, Rich in particular, have been involved in this area much longer than I, and so it's been a really steep learning curve for me, certainly over the past 5 years. So there's a lot of time and energy and goodwill invested in these programs to date. One thing I found really interesting when walking into this area is, having come off a farm myself and being so heavily reliant upon the Bureau and other extension services for forecast products, as a producer, we assume that the forecast products are always going to be tailored to us. And what I found really surprising is that agriculture represents somewhere around 6 or 7 in terms of users of forecast information. If you look at not only the Bureau, but the large private sector organisations like the Weather Channel, for example, who provide forecasting services, ag sits around number 6 in the run. So we're actually not that big a fry for organisations who provide weather and climate services. Now, that was a real surprise to me. However, I also then thought, well, that's why it's so important we have programs of work like this, like MCV, and like Forewarned is Forearmed, because it puts the light back on agriculture when working with organisations who are developing these products. Because if you're sitting 6 in the run, you're competing with other sectors, and we need to be doing that to keep on the radar of organisations and world-leading organisations who are providing these products.
I'm very aware that last time we visited the ops room in the Bureau of Meteorology, they pointed out that the airline industry is probably the biggest investor in forecast information, and you can understand why. They really need to know what's happening up there. And so in some ways, agriculture is the beneficiary of some of these larger investors as well.
Exactly. The energy sector, transportation, you mentioned airline, but also freight, tourism. There's a whole range of sectors. So, but they'll all benefit from the work we do here as well. So we're fully aware of that, the broader community benefit that programs like this provide.
I've had one more comment about the dogs that I thought I'd at least mention, from just saying, Kelpies are very good at picking storms. When storms are coming ahead of time, they either start barking an hour before. So yeah, there's a bit of science we have to do to figure out how the dogs know.
Yeah, there is.
On a more serious note, the one thing that has occurred to me working in climate change adaptation, particularly extreme events, is a comment from a farmer that said what they've seen as a change is the window in which they need to make a qualified decision, a quality decision. Over time, that window has narrowed. So the window they have to make a decision that locks them in for a period of time into a particular pathway has narrowed under a changing climate. And so where we see some of this technology feeding in is helping a farmer make a more qualified and informed decision in that narrower window. That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, if we think about the extreme events, and in Australia, we think of typically in terms of in Northern Australia, where I am, extreme heat, extreme drought, extreme flood. There's a terminology that's now been introduced, being flash droughts, and the rate of change, to your point, Rich, is quite short, and your ability to react is limited because the rate of change is quicker rather. That's important if you're relying upon a reactionary business management approach. Also heightens the importance of proactive management tools like this, because if you know you've got very small periods of time to respond, reactionary based management is going to be, I would argue, more costly than well thought through proactive investments enabled by tools like this. However, again, we'll say that, you know, the accuracy of these tools and the market's confidence in these tools needs to be right. Otherwise, we're potentially, you know, we're eroding the benefit, the economic benefit. There's no doubt about that.
I have a question from Michael. Has any work been done on modelling the impact of vegetation changes over time that has had on rainfall patterns? So it's almost the opposite of what, so we've done a lot of work on the impact of a changing climate on vegetation change, but the opposite, you know, the change in vegetation has on rainfall patterns. Could any predictions be made about future increase or loss of vegetation and weather patterns? I don't know if you want to take that on, or...
I think there'd be people probably on the call, including yourself, Rich, a better place to provide an answer to that. But what I could say is I'm not aware of any research that looks at the influence of vegetation type on weather. However, is there scenario modelling being undertaken now under the previous scenario you described, Rich, is the impact of climate scenarios on vegetation? Yes, there are a range of investments underway. But they're not necessarily looked at in isolation in terms of impact on vegetation type or abundance, for example. It's typically in the context of a production system, like a grazing system, for example, or a farming system. Back to you, Rich. I think you've been around much longer than I in this area.
What you identified there is probably a gap. We've done a lot of work of the impact of climate change on vegetation, as in the impact of climate change on wheat production, the impact of climate change on pasture growth patterns and pasture composition and species composition change over time, and grazing patterns. But there's probably a gap there where we cross across just the different sort of ecotypes, where we're saying, is there any impact on the trees on the farm or the native vegetation? I don't know that's as well understood. I am aware that there is some early modelling that looked at the impact of land clearing, of vast scale land clearing in Australia 100 years ago on changes of regional rainfall patterns. And so there is some evidence to say that rainfall, say in South Gippsland, is actually lower than it would have been had the original trees still been there because of the water cycle. So perhaps a bit of a gap in our knowledge there. The other modelling that has been done at a global scale is the increase in atmospheric CO2 on a general greening of vegetation in some of the well-watered areas of the world. So native forests in the Amazon basin, if we weren't chopping them down, they'd actually be growing faster under climate change. But we have to be careful with that interpretation, because where rainfall is a limiting factor, CO2 doesn't actually enhance growth when there's other first limiting factors.
I think there's some really interesting intersects between and you know, the managing partners within the Managing Climate Variability Program are kind of asking ourselves the question at the moment. MCV at this point in time is focused on seasonal forecasting specifically. But I think the issues that you're talking about there, Rich, are more land-based sectoral issues that look at production systems. And yes, it's important to think about the problem from a seasonal forecasting perspective, but you know, is there a place for MCV under the future phase, in phase 6, which starts in 2022, to be looking at answering some of the questions that you've just been describing there. I'd argue there probably is, because, you know, producers really want to understand the productive scenarios in the future in which they can operate. You know, we invest, or MLA invests in work that examines growing pastures under modified atmospheres. We've been doing some work in that area in isolation, not through the MCV program, but I could see you know, the partners articulating a range of future scenarios that they might like the research community to model and provide insights back to producers, like what type of vegetation, what's the appropriate mix of balance of tree and grass cover of the grasses, which of the C4 grasses should we be targeting that are palatable in which regions, you know, which legumes should we be targeting that are deep rooted for, you know, all of that is part of the same problem. And I guess the question we need to ask ourselves within MCV is that something that we want to more actively invest in as well?
Yeah, agree. And I think moving beyond just the grass part of the farm is quite important, especially as trees on farm become part of not just a carbon store, but heat stress and animal welfare aspects. So we need to know, if we're going to go down that track, are we planting the right species that are resilient to the climate that might emerge in that region as well? So not straightforward. Great. I think we're about on time. We did say we would go to about 1:45. If there's any final questions, I'd answer them. But apart from that, perhaps ask Graham, anything from your side?
No, all good. I think there'll be future webinars detailing some of this forewarned farm stuff, and I think there's already a recording for some of the Bureau products that the modelers have been working on, so that can be emailed to everybody. And on the vegetation side of things, I know, I mean, a lot of the focus is on what's happening in the atmosphere and oceans that drives their climate and weather patterns. And in terms of studies linked to vegetation, you can see occasionally some cloud pattern linked to areas where there is a bit more vegetation, and that sort of evapotranspiration that helps with some extra cloud. But you know, vegetation on its own doesn't make it rain. So there's a lot of this is about understanding what's happening in the atmosphere above our heads. But we know at a farm level, vegetation is really useful for reducing wind speed, evaporation, and having good soils and holding more moisture on farm. So it's a key part of the puzzle, but it just doesn't necessarily bring rain, I guess. But there's some great products, and really looking forward to what's going to pop out over the next year or two through this project.
Great. And with that, final thanks to Doug for the presentation, and thanks to everyone for attending. Please watch this space. There is a series of these presentations that will inform you of various aspects of the Forewarned Farm National Program. So please keep in touch, and we will send you all a link to the recording from today. So if someone wasn't attending, you can get that or watch it again later. Thanks again, Doug.
Thank you all. Bye for now.